A woman receives threatening letters from her dead husband, but when she's found murdered in a locked room, the truth is more terrifying than anyone imagined. What if the past isn't really dead? The vast desert stretched endlessly, bathed in the fading hues of twilight. As the truck jolted along the uneven road, Nurse Amy Leatherin clutched her hat against the dry, relentless wind. The journey had been long, the landscape monotonous, yet an unsettling tension filled the air as they neared their destination, an isolated archaeological dig site in the heart of Iraq. From a distance, the site resembled the ruins of a forgotten civilization, its tents and excavation pits scattered across the sandy terrain like remnants of an ancient curse. But it wasn't the ruins that sent a shiver down Amy's spine. It was something else, something intangible, as though the very air carried whispers of an untold secret. The truck came to a halt, and Amy stepped down, her heels sinking slightly into the sand. A tall, middle-aged man in dusty clothing approached Dr. Eric Leidner, the head archaeologist. He greeted her with a courteous but distracted air, his gaze flickering past her, toward the large, white-walled house that served as the team's living quarters. And then Amy saw her. Louise Leidner stood by the doorway, her delicate features ghostly pale against the deepening dusk. She was beautiful, striking even, but there was something in her wide, dark eyes that sent a prickle down Amy's spine. Fear. A fear so profound that it seemed woven into the very fabric of her being. Amy had seen nervous patients before, war veterans, fragile women suffering from imagined illnesses. But this was different. This was a woman living on the precipice of terror, constantly glancing over her shoulder, expecting what? A shadow, a voice from the past, a death sentence. That night, in the dimly lit parlor, Louise confided in her. The house was silent, except for the occasional whisper of the wind against the windows, a sound that made Louise flinch every time. "I know what you're thinking," she said with a small, nervous laugh, her fingers tightening around the porcelain teacup. "You think I'm a silly, hysterical woman, don't you?" Amy hesitated. "I think you're frightened, Mrs. Leidner, and that kind of fear doesn't come from nowhere." Louise exhaled shakily, her fingers tracing the delicate rim of her cup. Then, in a whisper, she began. "Before I married Eric, I had another husband. His name was Frederick Bosner. He was troubled, possessive, dangerous. He worked for the military, but he was caught passing secrets to the enemy. When they discovered his betrayal, he was executed." Amy frowned. "Executed?" Louise nodded, her gaze unfocused, as though trapped in the past. "But before he died, he swore revenge. He told me that if I ever married another man, he would come back for me." A pause. Then Louise reached into the small drawer of the desk beside her and pulled out a stack of letters. Yellowed with age, the handwriting on the envelopes was jagged, erraticas, though written by an unsteady hand. They started arriving a year after his death. At first I thought it was a cruel joke. But the details, no one else could have known them. He wrote about things only Frederick would know. The way I used to fold my handkerchiefs, the name of our cat, our secret hiding place as children. Amy shivered. But surely, someone else. Louise shook her head violently. Number. It was him. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind outside. Then, when I married Eric, the letters stopped. Louise let out a breath as if forcing herself to believe the nightmare had ended. I thought it was over. I convinced myself it was. Amy leaned forward. But they've started again, haven't they? Louise swallowed hard. Then, slowly, she reached into the desk once more and handed Amy a fresh envelope, its paper crisp, the ink still dark. Amy unfolded the letter and felt a chill slither down her spine as she read the words written in jagged, familiar script. "You thought I was dead, didn't you? But I never left, Louise. I am always watching, and soon I will come for you." A gust of wind rattled the shutters, and for the first time since she had arrived, Amy felt truly afraid. A gust of wind rattled the shutters, and for the first time since she had arrived, Amy felt truly afraid. Cliffhanger ending. Thena noise. A low, scraping sound from outside the window. Amy and Louise both froze. The oil lamp flickered as the wind howled against the walls. Louise's breath hitched. "Did you hear that?" Amy nodded slowly, rising from her chair. The room felt suddenly colder. She stepped toward the window, heart hammering against her ribs. The shutters creaked slightly as she pushed them open just a fraction, just enough to peer into the darkness beyond. Nothing. Just endless dunes of sand beneath the pale moonlight. And then, a shadow moved. A tall, dark silhouette stood just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow, motionless, watching. Amy's throat went dry. "There's someone out there." Louise's fingers dug into her arm. "No," she whispered, voice trembling. "Not someone. Him." And before Amy could react, the candlelight sputtered, the window latch snapped open, and a hand cold, pale, and unmistakably real shot through the gap. A murder shakes the desert. The golden light of the setting sun bathed the desert in an eerie stillness, a false sense of peace. But then, it shattered. A blood-curdling scream pierced the thick silence, so raw, so full of terror, that it seemed to hang in the air like a ghost. It came from the direction of Louise Leitner's quarters, and instantly panic gripped the camp. Nurse Amy Leatherin, her heart thundering in her chest, rushed toward the source of the scream, her mind racing. As she neared the door to Louise's locked bedroom, she could already feel something was horribly wrong. The room was eerily quiet now, the kind of silence that screamed danger, the air thick with an unnatural chill. Amy's hand trembled as she turned the door handle, and it creaked open with a dreadful slowness, revealing the nightmare within. There, sprawled on the floor, lay Louise's lifeless body, pale against the dark, rich carpet. Her skull, crushed in by a heavy, blunt object, had been a brutal, calculated strike. Blood pooled beneath her head in dark, viscous rivers, yet it wasn't the sight of the blood that haunted Amy. It was the look on Louise's face, frozen in terror, her wide, unblinking eyes staring at something just beyond her reach, as if in the grip of a final, dreadful realization. The room was locked from the inside. No one could have entered. The single window was barred, preventing anyone from climbing in. It was a perfect locked room mysteria puzzle that would have stumped the greatest detectives. But there were no answers, only more questions. The faint smell of the desert, carried by the evening breeze, mingled with the sharp scent of death as Captain Maitland stepped into the room. He stood frozen for a moment, his face pale under the weight of the horror before him. His hands clenched into fists, and then he took a long, slow breath, trying to keep his composure. "We'll solve this," he muttered to himself, but even he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that the murderer was out there, hidden in plain sight, always one step ahead, waiting to strike again. As Amy stood frozen in the doorway, the dread settled into her bones, and the unbearable thought gnawed at her mind. What if this death was not just another random tragedy? What if Louise's past, the terrifying threat from a dead man, was coming back to life? What if it had been waiting for this exact moment? Suddenly, a sound, like the faintest shuffle of footsteps, broke through her thoughts. She spun around, expecting to find someone. But no one was there. The question hung heavy in the air. Was Louise's death the end of the story, or was it only the beginning? And in that moment, Amy realized the true horror. The desert held its secrets close, but it was beginning to reveal them one murder at a time. The door to the dark unknown was just beginning to creak open. And who knew what horrors lay on the other side? Cliffhanger ending. Just as Amy turns to face the door again, the faintest sound of a whisper comes from within the shadows of the room. A soft, chilling voice, unmistakably familiar. "Help me, before it's too late." The question echoed in her mind, as the shadow in the corner seemed to grow. But before she could take another step, the door slammed shut behind her. What woe was in that room with her now? The master detective arrives. The desert stretched endlessly beneath the unforgiving sun, its golden sand shimmering with heat. Yet, within the shadow of the ancient ruins, a different kind of tension hung in the air, heavy, suffocating, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Hercule Poirot had been traveling through Iraq for a peaceful respite, but peace, it seemed, was a luxury his presence could never afford. He was summoned to the archaeological dig site by Dr. Riley, a dear friend and colleague, who had reached out with a cryptic message about an urgent case. There was something in the tone of the letter that even Poirot's sharp instincts couldn't ignore a call for help, but veiled in the dust of secrecy. As Poirot arrived, the atmosphere grew even more tense. The team was on edge, speaking in hushed tones, as they awaited the great detective's arrival. The stillness of the desert had somehow seeped into the camp, turning everyone into wary, quiet figures, haunted by the shadow of what had happened. Poirot's keen eyes surveyed the scene. He saw it all: the scattered evidence, the faces of the suspects, each one pretending not to notice him, yet each betraying their nervousness. His methodical mind immediately began to piece together what had occurred, but his first discovery, hidden among the papers on Louise Leidner's desk, shocked him to the core. The letters. The threatening letters that had driven Louise to madness, the ones she claimed were from her dead first husband, the man she had thought lost to time, were not written by an outside hand, not by some vengeful phantom. No, they were written in Louise's own handwriting. Poirot stood still for a moment, processing the revelation. His mind flickered over every detail of Louise's tragic end. The locked room, the brutal blow to her skull. Had she written those letters to herself? Or was it a deception, a cruel trick played by someone else? The depth of this question dug into his thoughts like an insistent thorn. Monday Dieu, he muttered under his breath, his hand resting lightly on his mustache, as he tried to piece together the pattern that was beginning to unfold. He had seen many things in his time, but never a mystery quite like this. Dr. Riley approached, looking shaken but trying to maintain composure. "Poirot, you've seen the letters. What do you make of it?" Poirot glanced up at him, his eyes piercing. "It is not as it seems, mon ami. This is the work of someone who knows the woman too well. Someone who has been hiding in plain sight, pulling strings from the shadows." His voice lowered to a near whisper. "And the question now is not who wrote these letters, but why." The silence between them stretched for a moment, both men deep in thought, when Poirot's gaze shifted towards the corner of the room. His attention was caught by something small but out of place, an old map, pinned to the wall. He took a step toward it, the sense that he was about to discover something vital overwhelming him. But before he could reach the map, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, swift, urgent. Poirot turned sharply, his senses alert. A woman, her face pale and drawn, entered the room. It was Anne Johnson, the widow who had been one of the last to see Louise alive. Her eyes were wide with panic, and her breath came in short gasps. "Poirot," she managed to choke out, "you need to come quick, something has happened." She looked over her shoulder as if afraid someone was following her. Poirot, ever the composed figure, regarded her quietly. "Mademoiselle, what is it?" Anne glanced at Dr. Riley, then back at Poirot. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "There's something in the room. We found it, but I don't know what to think. It's a message." Poirot's pulse quickened. "A message?" He motioned for her to lead the way. As they hurried to the scene, Poirot's mind raced. What new mystery had this woman uncovered? And was it connected to the past that seemed to have so violently resurfaced? They reached the room where Louise had died. Anne led him to a small wooden desk, where a single object lay hidden under a sheet of paper, as though it had been deliberately concealed. Poirot's fingers were steady as he reached out and lifted the paper. Underneath was a small, ornate object, a delicate locket, its chain broken, but the clasp still holding. Inside, a photograph of Louise with a man Poirot had never seen before. His eyebrows knitted in concentration. The locket's photograph, too, seemed to bear a resemblance to someone familiar, but Poirot couldn't place it. His eyes narrowed, and he turned to Anne, his voice calm but firm. "Tell me everything." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting to the side. "It was in Louise's belongings. But it's not just the locket. There's something in the back of it." Poirot, a note. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting to the side. "It was in Louise's belongings. But it's not just the locket. There's something in the back of it." Poirot, a note. Poirot's pulse quickened. He reached into the locket and carefully pried open the back, revealing a piece of folded paper, old and frayed at the edges. Slowly he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. "I am watching. It is not over." The room seemed to spin. The note was signed with a symbol Poirot recognized from an old Cassia symbol tied to a man believed dead, a ghost from the past. But what did it all mean? And, more crucially, was Louise's death truly the end, or was it just the beginning of something far darker? Cliffhanger ending. Poirot's hand trembled ever so slightly as he held the note in front of Anne. His voice was barely a whisper, heavy with realization. "It is never over, mademoiselle." But before Anne could reply, a loud crash echoed from the next room, the unmistakable sound of something or someone falling. Poirot's heart raced. He spun towards the door, but before he could reach it, the power went out, plunging the entire room into darkness. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway, their face hidden in shadow. Who was it? What danger loomed in the darkness? The woman hesitated, her eyes darting to the side. It was in Louise's belongings, but it's not just the locket. There's something in the back of it. Poirot, a note. Poirot's pulse quickened. He reached into the locket and carefully pried open the back, revealing a piece of folded paper, old and frayed at the edges. Slowly he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. "I am watching. It is not over." The room seemed to spin. The note was signed with a symbol Poirot recognized from an old Cassia symbol tied to a man believed dead, a ghost from the past. But what did it all mean? And, more crucially, was Louise's death truly the end, or was it just the beginning of something far darker? Cliffhanger ending. Poirot's hand trembled ever so slightly as he held the note in front of Anne. His voice was barely a whisper, heavy with realization. "It is never over, mademoiselle." But before Anne could reply, a loud crash echoed from the next room, the unmistakable sound of something or someone falling. Poirot's heart raced. He spun towards the door, but before he could reach it, the power went out, plunging the entire room into darkness. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway, their face hidden in shadow. Who was it? What danger loomed in the darkness? A perfect alibi. The evening was thick with tension, the kind of tension that hung in the air like the stillness before a storm. Hercule Poirot sat across from the gathered suspects in the dimly lit drawing room of the archaeological site. The desert winds outside howled like a beast, but inside, the only sound was the slow ticking of the clock on the mantel, a reminder that time was slipping away. Each of the suspects had been questioned in turn. Anne Johnson, the widow, had been in the camp's kitchen when Louise's body was discovered, surrounded by witnesses who had seen her there. Dr. Riley, the physician, had been in his quarters, writing notes on his recent medical studies' alibi, verifiable by the servants who had brought him his meals. Captain Maitland, the military man, had been patrolling the perimeter of the dig site, confirming his position with multiple men who had seen him. And then there was Captain Cedric Muse, the quiet but brooding figure. He had been far from the scene, in the distant ruins, speaking to a local guide about the excavation plans. His alibi, rock solid, a series of verifications that placed him nowhere near the crime. All of them, without exception, had a perfect alibi. Yet, as Poirot sat back, his fingers steepled in front of him, his sharp eyes glinting with the understanding that only he seemed to possess, he could not hide the small, satisfied smile that played at the corners of his lips. "A perfect alibi, my friends," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight, "is often the most imperfect truth." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. They all stared at him, unsure of how to respond, or whether to challenge him. Anne shifted nervously in her chair, her hands wringing the hem of her dress. "What are you saying, Poirot?" she asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "Are you suggesting someone is lying? We all have been truthful, each of us has been accounted for." Poirot raised one hand gently, signaling for her to wait. "Ah, madame," he replied, his voice laced with a quiet confidence. "It is not that you are lying. No, no. But sometimes in the dance of deception, the truth hides itself in plain sight. It is not the alibi that matters, but the motive and the opportunity. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as Poirot's words reverberated in their minds. Each person in the room shifted uneasily, and the shadows of doubt began to creep in. What if someone had devised a clever ruse to deceive them all? Poirot continued, his voice as smooth as silk. Consider this. You all have your alibis verifiable, watertight, but there is one thing that you cannot hide from me. He paused, his gaze scanning each face. The manner in which you present yourselves, the smallest detail, the fleeting glance, the slip of the tongue. As Poirot spoke, his eyes flickered toward Dr. Riley, who had been unusually calm during the entire investigation. His fingers twitched ever so slightly as Poirot's words sank in. Doctor. Riley's alibi, though solid, seemed almost too perfect. No one had seen him leave his quarters, and yet there was something about the way he spoke of the crime scene that made Poirot's instincts prick. The detective leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the doctor. You see, Monsieur Riley, your calmness, your assurance is troubling. Is it not curious that you seemed so unfazed by the brutality of the crime? It is as though you knew the truth, even before you had seen the body. Dr. Riley's face remained impassive, but Poirot could see the faintest twitch in his eyes, a crack in his armor. Or perhaps, Poirot continued, it is Captain Mews who, with his military precision, could have carefully engineered an alibi so perfect that no one would question his whereabouts. Anne, unable to sit still, let out a shaky breath. Are you suggesting we are all involved in some conspiracy, that none of us are innocent? Poirot's sharp eyes fixed on her. No, madame, he said softly. What I am suggesting is that one of you, perhaps even the most unlikely, has woven a web of deception so intricate that it leaves no trace. They have managed to convince everyone of their innocence because they are the perfect actor in this drama. The tension in the room grew thick, as though each person was now questioning the others, unsure of who was truly innocent and who was playing the role of the murderer. They exchanged furtive glances, but no one spoke. Poirot rose from his chair, walking to the window and gazing out into the desert night. And therein lies the mystery. The perfect alibi, while convincing, is a mask. It hides the true nature of the crime, and it is up to me to uncover the cracks, the hidden flaws in that mask. As he turned back to face the room, his voice dropped to a near whisper. And you, Monsieur Maitland, you believe that your reputation alone will save you. But as I always say, reputation is the shield of the guilty. Captain Maitland's hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles white. He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, a sudden crash came from outside the window. Poirot's sharp eyes widened. He didn't need to look twice. Something had happened, something unexpected, something that would change everything. With urgency in his steps, Poirot made his way toward the door. But just before he reached the threshold, he turned to the group and gave them one last chilling observation. Innocent or guilty, my friends, we shall soon see. But do not believe that your perfect alibis will save you now. Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot opened the door, the wind howled even louder, and a dark figure appeared in the doorway, a figure that no one had seen coming, whose presence chilled them all to the bone. The figure stepped forward into the light, and, in their hand, they held something dark and dripping. What is that? Anne whispered, her voice shaking. Poirot's face went pale as he recognized it immediately. A bloodied, antique knife. The figure spoke in a voice cold as ice. The truth is here, Poirot, but so is the killer. With those words, the door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. Suspects and secrets. The tension in the drawing room had reached a fever pitch, and Hercule Poirot, though seemingly calm, was as sharp as ever. His eyes scanned the group of suspects, each one holding their breath under his piercing gaze, knowing that the smallest gesture could betray them. Poirot's voice broke the silence, steady and deliberate. You see, my friends, a mystery is like a game of chess. Each move is calculated, each piece has its role, and it is the smallest details that reveal the true nature of the game. He paused, letting his words sink in. I believe it is time we take a closer look at you all. Father Lavigny, a scholar or an impostor? Father Lavigny, the priest who had arrived at the dig just days before Louise's death, seemed an unlikely suspect. His pious demeanor and soft voice painted the picture of a man devoted to faith. Yet there was something off. Poirot could see it in the way Lavigny's eyes flickered nervously when the conversation turned to the past. The priest had been an unexpected arrival at the site. Was it truly divine providence, or was he hiding something? Poirot stepped closer to him. Father, he asked with a measured tone, you are a scholar of sorts, yes. But tell me, why did you ask so many questions about Louise's late first husband? A simple curiosity, or something more? Lavigny's hands tightened around the prayer beads he wore, but his voice remained steady. I simply wanted to understand the history of this site, the people, their connections. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Is it a coincidence that you have shown such interest in a dead man who, perhaps, is not quite as dead as we thought? Father Lavigny's gaze faltered for just a moment, but the flicker was enough. Poirot made a mental note. Something was off, and it wasn't just his presence at the dig. Joseph Mercado, a historian or a blackmailer? Next, Poirot turned his attention to Joseph Mercado, the historian whose keen knowledge of ancient texts had made him invaluable at the site. Mercado was a man of impressive intellect, but there was an undercurrent of something darker beneath his polished exterior. He kept to himself, never engaging in conversation unless absolutely necessary. His demeanor was cold, clinical. Even in Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that Mercado knew more about Louise's death than he was letting on. Mr. Mercado, Poirot began, his voice gentle but commanding, you seem to know more than most about the history of this place. Yet, it is not the ancient tombs that concern me, but your relationship with the Leidner family. It seems strained. What is it that you were hiding from your colleagues? Mercado's jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed. I don't know what you're implying, he said, his voice low and controlled. I am simply here to work. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. Ah, but the past is never truly behind us, Mr. Mercado. I would suggest, if you have nothing to hide, you might be wise to share more about your history with the Leidners. Mercado remained silent, his expression unreadable, but Poirot could see the tension in his body, the way he clenched his fists. Mercado was hiding something, and Poirot was getting closer to uncovering it. Richard Carey, Louise's close friend, or a rejected lover. Richard Carey, Louise's closest friend at the dig, appeared to be a man deeply loyal to her, though he was noticeably shaken by her tragic death. He was often seen looking longingly at her picture, lost in thought, as if haunted by memories. To an outsider, he seemed the picture of grief, but Poirot wasn't fooled. A grief-stricken man was often the best mask for a guilty one. Poirot's voice cut through the heavy silence. Mr. Carey, you were close to Louise, yes, very close. His eyes pierced through the man like a knife. But one must ask why, after all these years, were you the one to spend the most time by her side in her final days? Carey's face flushed, and he took a slow breath, his fingers fiddling with his cufflink. I don't know what you mean. Louise was a dear friend, her husband. He wasn't good to her, Poirot. We were just friends, trying to support her, that's all. Poirot narrowed his eyes. There was more to it, much more. The way Carey said husband, the slight tremor in his voice, it spoke of a past entwined with unspoken feelings. Had Richard Carey been more than just a friend? Was there unrequited love that twisted into something darker? Poirot's instincts screamed that this man was hiding his true feelings. He had loved Louise, and perhaps he wasn't quite over her. Bill Coleman and David Emmett, connected to Louise's past in ways they won't admit. The final two suspects, Bill Coleman and David Emmett, had been with Louise for years. Bill, a charming but secretive man, had a history with Louise's first husband, and his connections to the past seemed a little too intimate. David, on the other hand, had been a friend to Louise's first husband, yet his presence at the dig seemed far too coincidental. Both men were haunted by the same dark past, yet neither was willing to open up about their connection to Louise's former life. Poirot's gaze fell on Bill Coleman first. "Mr. Coleman," he said, his voice like velvet, "it is clear that you have a past with Louise, but there is something you have not mentioned, a certain family secret, perhaps." Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied curtly. Poirot leaned in closer. "No. And yet you were one of the few who had access to the first husband's personal belongings." "Yes. How curious." His eyes narrowed. "Could it be that you are hiding something far more dangerous than a simple secret?" Next, Poirot turned to David Emmett, who had been unusually quiet throughout the conversation. His gaze never met Poirot's, as though he were trying to avoid eye contact. "Mr. Emmett," Poirot said softly, "you were close to Louise's first husband. Yes, you were there when he died. Yet you say you had no reason to be here. Why is that, I wonder?" David's hands clenched into fists, his face turning pale. "I didn't come here to discuss the past. I came here to help." His voice quivered, betraying his calm facade. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The past is never far behind us, Mr. Emmett. Not for you, not for any of us." Could Louise's first husband still be alive? As the tension in the room thickened, Poirot stood still for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle upon the suspects. Could Louise's first husband still be alive? He had heard rumors of a man who had disappeared years ago. And now, those rumors were beginning to feel less like hearsay and more like the truth. Poirot slowly turned to face the group, his eyes dark with knowing. "You see, my friends, the question is not whether someone here is guilty, but whether someone among you is still alive, someone you thought was dead for so long." The room fell completely silent. No one dared speak, yet the air seemed to hum with the realization that the mystery had just escalated to terrifying new heights. Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot's words sank in, the lights flickered for a moment, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then, from the corner of the room, a soft, almost imperceptible sound was heard: footsteps, slow and deliberate. The room went cold. Poirot turned toward the sound. A figure stood in the doorway, a man, his face hidden in the darkness. But from the silhouette, Poirot could tell one thing. This was the man they all believed had died years ago, the dead husband. "I have returned," the figure spoke, his voice low and hollow. The group gasped in unison, unable to believe their eyes. A second murder silence must be kept. The evening air was thick with unease as the group gathered in the drawing room, their eyes darting nervously from one suspect to the next. The weight of Poirot's last statement about the possible return of Louise's first husband still hung in the air, unanswered questions swirling like dust in the dim light. But it wasn't long before a sudden, sharp scream shattered the fragile tension. Anne Johnson, the quiet and observant secretary, had collapsed by the window. Her body twisted unnaturally as she gasped for air, her hands clawing at her throat. The glass of water she had just taken a sip from lay shattered on the floor. The faint aroma of bitter almonds filled the room, an unmistakable sign of poison. Poirot rushed to her side, his keen eyes scanning her body, the scene, the atmosphere, as though a puzzle was slowly piecing itself together before his very eyes. Her skin had already begun to lose its color, the edges of her lips turning blue, her breathing shallow and labored. She tried to speak, her voice nothing more than a desperate whisper. "The window, the window." Anne's eyes fluttered as she struggled to keep her gaze focused, the words slipping from her cracked lips like the final thread of a dying hope. Her hands trembled as she pointed weakly toward the tall, dark window at the far end of the room. But before anyone could follow her gaze, the life drained from her eyes, and she fell silent. The room was still, too still. The rest of the guests stood frozen, their faces pale with shock. Poirot, ever composed, remained calm, his eyes lingering on the empty glass, his mind already working through the possibilities. He had seen this before too many times, in fact. The cold precision, the deliberate choice of poison, and the cryptic final words. "This," Poirot murmured softly to himself, "is no random act. It is a message, a warning." He turned to the group, his gaze now intense, the air crackling with the tension that only he could sense. It is clear now. This is not one murder, but a continuation of a very old story. Someone is playing the final act of a tale that has been buried, forgotten until now. His words hung in the air like a thick fog, and the group shifted uncomfortably. But Poirot wasn't finished. Poirot's realization, Death's pattern. Poirot's gaze swept across the room. The window. What did Anne mean? Her last words echoed in his mind, the symbolism of a window, though possibility of something hidden, something to be revealed. But there was something more. A familiar feeling, a thread of a pattern he had seen before, started to unravel in his mind. The murders, they were not just happening randomly. They were connected. And the connection was growing stronger with each passing minute. Poirot turned to the others, his voice steady but urgent. "Tell me, what do we know of this house? Its history, its occupants. I must know everything. Nothing is to be overlooked." The room fell into a stunned silence, everyone exchanging looks as if someone had just spoken an unspoken truth. It was clear that none of them truly understood what was at stake. They had been playing a game with deadly consequences. Suspicion casts a dark shadow. Richard Carey, his face drawn and pale, was the first to break the silence. The house was built by Louise's first husband, a man with connections, some of them very dangerous. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, but his eyes were far away. Dangerous, indeed. But what of the window? What role does it play? Anne spoke of it in her final moments, but what exactly does it mean? Before anyone could respond, Bill Coleman stepped forward, his voice low, filled with unease. "There are rumors, Poirot. Rumors of unfinished business, debts that were never repaid, people tied to the past, people who disappeared, leaving behind only questions." Poirot's eyes narrowed. He could feel the weight of the past bearing down on them all. The secrets, the lies that were buried under years of dust and silence. This is more than unfinished business. This is revenge, and someone in this room is desperate enough to complete the story. Cliffhanger, ending. Who else is marked for death? Poirot's voice was calm, but there was a tremor of certainty in it. But who will be next? Who among you is marked for death? He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on each suspect in turn, their faces now stricken with fear. Each one knew they were walking a fine line, a line that was slowly being drawn tighter with each passing second. Suddenly a loud bang echoed through the house, a sharp sound that seemed to reverberate in the very walls. Everyone spun toward the source, their hearts racing. But it wasn't just any bang, it was the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut, followed by a loud crash. In a rush of frantic movement, the guests scrambled toward the noise. The hallway outside was dark, the shadows swallowing every corner. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the area, taking in every detail, every movement, every breath. And then, in the distance, a figure appeared. Staggered was the better word. A man, Bill Coleman, but his face was a mask of horror, twisted in an expression of disbelief and terror. His hands trembled as he reached out to Poirot, unable to speak, his lips moving soundlessly. And then, the truth hit them like a ton of bricks. Bill Coleman had seen something that none of them were ready to face. The truth. The final truth that would end it all. Poirot stepped forward, his calm, measured voice cutting through the chaos. "What did you see, Mr. Coleman? What is it that you are hiding?" But before Coleman could answer, the lights flickered once more, and, in that split second, everything went dark. A second later, the sound of another body hitting the floor echoed through the house. The masterstroke. The evening sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room where Poirot had gathered all the remaining guests. The air was thick with anticipation, tension so heavy it felt like the walls themselves might crack under the pressure. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his presence commanding, his eyes sharp as ever. Every individual in the room, each of them a suspect, each of them hiding something, could feel the weight of his scrutiny. There was no more dancing around the truth, no more veils of mystery to pull away. Poirot had pieced it all together. He knew the story, the lies, the betrayals. And now, The time had come for the final revelation. Poirot's eyes swept across the room, one by one, until they landed on a man who had stood in the background for most of the investigation, Eric Leitner. He had been quiet, reserved, hardly noticeable at times, but Poirot's sharp mind had already connected the dots. Poirot took a deep breath, his voice calm, yet laced with an undeniable edge. "It is time, mes amis, time for the truth to be revealed." The room fell dead silent. Everyone watched Poirot, some fearful, some confused, all uncertain about what was to come. Poirot's gaze turned cold, unwavering as he spoke. "Eric Leitner is not who he claims to be. His true identity is Frederick Bosner, a man who disappeared 15 years ago, leaving behind a life full of questions. He faked his death, assumed the identity of another man, and returned to haunt the woman he once called his wife, Louise Leitner." A collective gasp swept through the room. Eyes widened, jaws dropped, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. Everyone looked to Eric Frederick with disbelief. The transformation, the subtle changes in his demeanor, his reluctance to talk about the past suddenly, it all made sense. Poirot continued, his voice steady, cutting through the stunned silence. Frederick Bosner's obsession with Louise never ended. He tormented her, sending threatening letters from the grave, letters that she believed were from her dead first husband. And all this time Louise was trapped in the web of his manipulation, unable to escape the past that wouldn't die. Richard Carey, standing beside the others, took a hesitant step forward. "But what about the murder? Why did he kill her? She was his wife, for God's sake." Poirot's piercing gaze never wavered as he turned to Richard. "Ah, mon ami, love, jealousy, and obsession. A dangerous combination, is it not?" When Louise, finally free of his grip, began to fall for another man, Frederick could not bear it. He could not allow anyone to have her, not after all the years he spent controlling her. A murmur rippled through the room, but Poirot raised his hand, demanding silence. The locked room mystery, a brilliant illusion, crafted with meticulous care. Frederick took advantage of the very architecture of the house. He dropped a heavy quern stone from the rooftop, aiming it directly at Louise's head. She never knew what hit her instantly. Her life was taken. Then, he closed the window himself, creating the illusion of a locked room. The mystery was not in the room, but in the mind of the murderer. The guests stood motionless, unable to comprehend the depths of Frederick's malice. The shocking truth, so unexpected, so perfectly executed, left them speechless. It was almost as if they were trapped in a twisted game, one that had been played out for years without their knowledge. But Poirot was not finished yet. He could feel the air growing heavier, as though there was still something else, something still lurking in the shadows. He leaned forward, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "But I ask you, mes amis, is the story truly over? Have we uncovered every truth, every lie? Or is there one more secret buried in the desert sands, waiting to be unearthed?" The question hung in the air like a dark cloud, leaving everyone with a sense of unease. They looked around, unsure of whether to feel relieved or terrified. Poirot's eyes gleamed with an unsettling mix of satisfaction and uncertainty. The lies, they always have a way of resurfacing. Even the most carefully crafted stories can have a twist, a shadow that lingers. What did Anne mean with her last words? The window. The window. The others exchanged nervous glances, the weight of Poirot's words sinking in. Was there more to this than they had realized? Had they uncovered a mere fraction of the truth? Or was the real horror still hidden, waiting to be revealed? Poirot turned slowly toward the window that Anne had pointed to before her death. The darkened room now seemed colder, the shadows longer. He stood there for a moment, silent, deep in thought. And then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, he spoke again. "We are not finished. The story is not yet concluded." At that moment, a loud crash echoed from outside the room. A shuffling sound followed, as if something or someone was moving in the shadows. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his face expressionless. "What was that?" he muttered to himself, though it felt like he already knew the answer. Without another word, he strode to the door and threw it open. revealing a figure standing just outside the silhouette barely visible in the dim light. A figure that none of them had expected to see again. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the others standing in the dark, unsure of what had just happened. The air was thick with dread. Cliffhanger ending. Suddenly the shuffling sound grew louder. The figure stepped into the room this time. Its features were unmistakable. It was someone they had believed was long gone, someone who shouldn't have been there. And as the figure's face came into full view, it was as if time itself stood still. "It cannot be." A voice stammered from the crowd, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, their eyes, cold and unblinking, stared straight ahead right at Poirot. Poirot turned slowly, a smile creeping across his face, though his eyes burned with intensity. His voice, soft and steady, sent chills down their spines. "Ah, mes amis, the game is far from over." The aftermath. The dusty silence of the evening seemed to hold its breath as Poirot's investigation neared its conclusion. The room was filled with a strange mix of emotions: relief, dread, and an unsettling tension that still lingered like the heat of a desert wind. The final twist had taken them all by surprise. Father Lavigne, the man who had been a silent figure of religious piety, had somehow slipped past their suspicion. But Poirot, ever vigilant, had seen through the facade. His mind had pieced together the fragments, the subtle inconsistencies in Father Lavigne's story, the strange artifacts hidden in plain sight, and the cold detachment in his eyes when the others were lost in grief. And now, in this final moment, the mask fell. Poirot stood in front of him, his sharp eyes never leaving Father Lavigne. "Father Lavigne," he said softly, the words carrying weight, "you are not who you say you are. You are Raoul Minière, an infamous artifact smuggler." The room erupted in shock. Gasps filled the air as Father Lavigne's face paled, the pious mask cracking like glass, revealing a much darker truth. The man who had preached compassion and faith was, in reality, a criminal, a man who had made a fortune by stealing priceless treasures from the ancient lands. He had hidden in plain sight, using his position as a priest to shield himself from suspicion. Poirot continued, his voice cutting through the silence. Menière's plan was simply use the chaos and death to cover his tracks, using Louise's mysterious murder as a diversion. But the one thing he didn't count on was me. Father Lavigne's eyes flickered with panic as Poirot's words struck like a thunderclap. It wasn't just the man's identity that was at risk. His freedom was slipping away, and his carefully crafted life was crumbling before his eyes. But Poirot wasn't finished. There was one final blow to land. "And it was not just you, Raoul. You had help," Poirot said, his eyes shifting toward the shadows where the accomplice stood, a woman whose presence had been barely noticeable until now. She stepped forward, her face tight with fear and guilt. It was Sheila, the woman who had always been on the fringes of the mystery, never truly part of the circle of suspects. "Sheila, too, is part of your scheme, your accomplice in crime, aiding you in your illegal activities. Together you've plundered and betrayed, hiding in the cloak of religion and respectability." The room was silent once more, this time filled with disbelief. Sheila's face crumpled as she fell to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her betrayal cut deeper than the others had imagined, for she had fooled them all. A gentle smile, an innocent demeanor, it had all been an act. Now there was nowhere left to hide. With a swift motion, Poirot gestured for the authorities, who had been standing just outside. The door opened, and two uniformed officers entered, their eyes sharp with determination. The plot had been uncovered, the criminals unmasked. "Raoul Minière and Sheila," Poirot said, his voice unwavering. "You are under arrest for smuggling, murder, and conspiracy." The officers moved quickly, handcuffing them both before escorting them out of the room. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate with their departure, but a new unease settled into the hearts of the remaining guests. The desert, it seemed, had hidden more than just one secret. As Sheila and David Emot exchanged a lingering glance, the weight of their shared ordeal seemed to lift. A bond formed in the wake of chaos, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to believe that there might be hope after all. Nurse Leatherin, however, was not so sure. She stood by the window, her face lost in thought, staring into the night. Her brow furrowed as the full scope of what had happened began to sink in. "But Poirot," she said quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "How many more lies are hidden beneath these ancient sands? We've uncovered so much, yet I feel as though there's still something we've missed. Something waiting to be discovered." Poirot turned to her, his expression grave but thoughtful. The room had fallen silent once again, every person caught in the final threads of Poirot's mind, his brilliance now on full display. He paused for a long moment, as if weighing his own words. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but full of quiet wisdom. "Truth is like the desert. It buries everything, until the winds of time uncover it once more." His words echoed through the room, leaving an uncomfortable weight in the air. The desert, with all its mysteries and secrets, had given up one answer. But how many more stories lay buried beneath its scorching sands, waiting to be revealed? And just as everyone thought the case was over, as if the very desert itself had whispered a warning, Poirot's piercing eyes caught something just outside the window. His gaze faltered for the briefest second, his mind racing. Was it just his imagination, or had someone, just moved in the distance? Before he could say another word, the figure disappeared into the shadows. The others had not seen it, and yet the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. It was as though the mystery was not truly over, that one final twist was still out there, waiting. Poirot turned slowly toward the door, his lips curling into a faint, enigmatic smile. "The story does not end here, mes amis. It never does." The room fell into a tense silence. The wind outside howled, and the desert sands continued their eternal dance, whispering their secrets to anyone willing to listen. And as Poirot left the room, his footsteps echoing into the unknown, one last question lingered in the air. Cliffhanger ending. What other truths remained hidden beneath the sands?